Cleo was a cat with a quiet grace. Her sleek, cream-colored fur shimmered under the dim light of the shelter, her sharp blue eyes full of curiosity and wariness. As a Siamese, she carried a regal air about her, but inside, she was uncertain, overwhelmed, and sad. It had been a long road to the shelter. She still remembered her old home, the family who once adored her, at least, she thought they did. But things had changed. She couldn't explain it, but she had begun to feel like an outsider in her own house. Perhaps they had grown tired of her demands for affection, her nightly visits for cuddles, and her obsession with basking in sunbeams. It didn't make sense to her, but one chilly autumn afternoon, she found herself placed in a carrier and driven to a new, unfamiliar place. When Cleo arrived at the shelter, she was greeted by the clamor of other cats. Some were mewing excitedly from their cages, some were pacing restlessly, and others were curled up, eyes glazed with the same weariness Cleo felt. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, and the sounds of busy workers filled the space, clipboards, phone calls, and the occasional shout of a cat hissing at another. For the first few days, Cleo refused to eat. She curled up in the corner of her cage, her back pressed against the cold metal bars. Her stomach growled in protest, but the desire for comfort was stronger. She just wanted to be left alone, to not be so painfully aware of how different everything was. She missed the warmth of her old home, the smell of her owner's perfume and the sound of soft footsteps padding around the house. But the shelter was no place for a shy, sensitive cat like Cleo. Every day, she watched as other cats came and went. Some were adopted, whisked away to new homes with enthusiastic families. Others were returned, looking bewildered and scared, much like Cleo herself. Yet she remained, day after day, waiting for something to change. One day, the shelter worker came by and opened her cage. Cleo lifted her head, confused, yet wary. The worker crouched down, her eyes kind. "Hi, Cleo," she said softly. The cat's ears flicked at the sound of her name, but she didn't respond. "You're so beautiful," the woman continued, holding out a hand. "But I think you're feeling a little lost, aren't you?" Cleo's eyes locked with the woman's. She wasn't sure if she understood what the woman meant, but she knew one thing for sure: she was tired. Tired of being alone, tired of the endless waiting. But nothing seemed to change. Days turned into weeks. Cleo had almost given up hope that anyone would come for her when the shelter's doors creaked open one bright Saturday morning. A woman stepped inside, her expression tired but determined. Her name was Margaret, and she had just moved into the neighborhood. She had spent the last few months trying to settle into her new life, figuring out her new job, and adjusting to the silence of her empty apartment. After a long work week, she decided it was time to bring some warmth into her life, perhaps with a new companion. She wandered through the rows of cages, eyeing the cats with curiosity, wondering which one might fit with her life. That was when she saw Cleo. The Siamese cat was curled up in a corner, her fur gleaming softly under the shelter lights, her eyes half closed, a silent longing in her gaze. Margaret's heart melted. She had never owned a cat before, but there was something about Cleo that immediately struck her, an elegant sadness, a loneliness that mirrored her own. Margaret crouched down beside the cage, and their eyes met. "Hey there," she said gently. Her voice was soft, a whisper of kindness that seemed to reach the depths of Cleo's soul. For a moment, Cleo stayed still. She wasn't sure if she should trust this woman, if she was just another person who would pass her by, just like the others. But there was something different about Margaret. The way she looked at Cleo was warm and full of hope. Cleo, unsure of why, took a tentative step forward. Margaret smiled, her heart lifting as she slowly extended her hand through the bars. Cleo sniffed it, her whiskers twitching, and then, something incredible happened. Cleo took another step forward, allowing Margaret to gently scratch behind her ears. The tension in Cleo's body melted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she relaxed. Margaret's voice dropped to a gentle murmur. "You're so beautiful, and so strong." Cleo didn't understand the words, but the warmth in Margaret's tone spoke to her in a way she couldn't ignore. She wanted to be loved. She needed to be loved. Margaret continued to visit Cleo every day for the next week, sitting by her cage and quietly talking to her. She brought treats, coaxing Cleo to eat and become more comfortable in her presence. Cleo, ever cautious but growing more hopeful, began to show little signs of trust. She let Margaret pet her more often, nuzzling her hand once in a while. But still, Cleo wasn't ready to leave just yet. She was still scarred from her past, still unsure of how much she could trust this woman who was so kind to her. But Margaret didn't give up. She kept coming back, showing up with patience and love, even when Cleo remained distant. Then, one afternoon, as Cleo lay curled up in the back of her cage, Margaret stepped into the room once again. She held something small and shiny in her hands, a collar. She attached it to Cleo's cage, hoping the gesture would be a sign of things to come. "Come on, Cleo," she whispered, "let's take you home." And as Cleo looked up at Margaret with those blue eyes, a flicker of hope sparked in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Cleo's first ride in Margaret's car was nothing like she expected. The world outside blurred in streaks of color, green trees, the bright blue sky, and the occasional flash of a distant car. It was all too fast for Cleo. She was used to stillness, to the safe, quiet corners of her cage. This new world felt so overwhelming, so vast. She stayed nestled in her carrier, her wide eyes fixated on the unfamiliar sights, her tail twitching nervously. Margaret kept glancing over at her, talking softly as if to reassure her. "It's okay, Cleo. You're safe. We're almost home." But Cleo was far from convinced. She didn't know this woman well enough to trust her completely. And home? What did home even mean anymore? She had thought her old house was her home once. That had ended so painfully. She wasn't sure what this new place could offer. The drive seemed long. It felt like the hours stretched on, until finally, the car slowed to a stop. Margaret turned off the engine and reached over to open the carrier. "This is it, Cleo. We're home." Cleo's heart pounded as the door opened, and she was gently lifted into Margaret's arms. The scent of lavender and soft linen filled the air, and Cleo caught the faint hum of a radio playing quietly in the background. She couldn't help but be intrigued. Margaret carried her into the apartment, her footsteps slow and steady, as if giving Cleo time to adjust. The apartment was cozy, small but warm, with windows letting in just enough sunlight to create a soft glow in the rooms. The floors were hardwood, the walls painted a soothing shade of pale yellow. A soft rug lay in the middle of the living room, and a few potted plants dotted the windowsills. Margaret placed Cleo down gently on the rug. The cat's paws sank into the softness beneath her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Cleo felt a sense of calm. The sounds of the outside world, the bustling streets, were distant. Here, in this small space, there was quiet. She took a few cautious steps, her tail held high but her body tense. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint shift of light made her pause. She explored the edges of the room, testing her new surroundings. The soft scent of fresh flowers mixed with the faint aroma of food cooking in the kitchen. There was something so peaceful about it. No loud noises, no sudden movements, just warmth. Margaret watched from the doorway, giving Cleo the space she needed. She knew it was going to take time. Cleo wasn't ready to be her best friend yet. She wasn't ready to curl up on the couch or demand attention. But Margaret was patient. She sat down on the couch, her eyes never leaving Cleo. The next few days were filled with small moments of progress. Margaret would leave the door to the bedroom slightly ajar, letting Cleo choose whether she wanted to come in. Every time Cleo hesitated but then took that first step into the room, Margaret's heart would swell. The cat was growing more comfortable. She wasn't quite ready to snuggle up beside her, but she was slowly starting to trust. Margaret would sit on the couch, a book in her hands, letting Cleo observe her, allowing the silence to settle between them. Occasionally, Cleo would inch closer, sniffing Margaret's legs or brushing against the edge of the couch. But the distance remained, an invisible line that neither would cross too quickly. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow across the apartment, Margaret decided it was time to make dinner. She moved around the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of pasta and vegetables, the soft sounds of clinking pots and pans filling the air. Cleo, curious as ever, padded into the kitchen, her wide blue eyes watching Margaret carefully. Margaret smiled, not turning around immediately. "I see you're starting to trust me a little more." Cleo mewed quietly, a soft, almost tentative sound. It was the first time in days that Margaret had heard her speak, even if it was just a faint mew of curiosity. "There's no rush," Margaret said, glancing at the cat. "You take your time." That evening, Cleo settled on the windowsill, watching the world outside as Margaret ate her meal. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Slowly, a sense of belonging began to grow inside her. She still didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time, it didn't feel so frightening. This apartment, with its soft light and quiet sounds, was beginning to feel like something she could call home. By the end of the week, Cleo was sleeping more peacefully, her body relaxed as she curled up on her favorite spot on the rug. Margaret often sat beside her, reading or simply enjoying the comfort of having a companion nearby. Cleo didn't mind the quiet conversations Margaret had with her, even if she didn't always understand the words. It was the tone, the kindness, the soft affection that mattered. But there was still one thing Cleo couldn't quite let go of, her fear of being alone. One day, when Margaret went to work, Cleo paced the apartment, feeling the familiar sense of restlessness creeping in. She wanted to follow Margaret. She wanted to know where she was going, what she was doing. The silence of the apartment was too much to bear. For the first time, Cleo felt that deep ache inside her, the ache of being alone. As the hours passed, Cleo's unease grew. She knew Margaret would be back soon, but in that moment, the shelter's loneliness crept back into her heart. She pressed her paws against the door, a soft whimper escaping her lips. She didn't want to be left behind. She didn't want to go back to that empty silence. But just as the anxiety began to build, the sound of a key turning in the door filled the room. Cleo's ears perked up, her heart lifting. Margaret's voice called out, soft and familiar, "Cleo? I'm home." The moment Margaret stepped inside, Cleo rushed to her side, mewing in a way that surprised even her. Margaret bent down, her arms outstretched to scoop Cleo into her embrace. The cat melted into her touch, the tension in her body dissolving. "You missed me, didn't you?" Margaret whispered, holding Cleo close. The warmth of her arms, the steady beat of her heart, it was everything Cleo had been longing for. From that day on, Cleo never felt quite so alone. Margaret had shown her a new world, one where she wasn't just a stray or an abandoned pet, she was part of a family. She didn't have to wonder anymore. She belonged. As the weeks passed, Cleo's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The wary, reserved cat who had first arrived at Margaret's apartment, reluctant to trust and hesitant to come out of her shell, was now a creature of comfort and contentment. The apartment had become her world, and Margaret had become her everything. Each morning, Cleo would curl up at the foot of Margaret's bed, waiting for the soft sound of the alarm clock to ring. The moment it did, Cleo would stretch lazily, her body unfolding like a gentle flower opening to the first rays of the sun. Margaret, always the early riser, would sit up in bed, stretch herself, and then reach down to give Cleo a gentle scratch behind the ears. Cleo would purr, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the room, as if telling Margaret she was ready for another day by her side. Margaret's routine had become Cleo's routine. In the mornings, Margaret would sip her coffee while Cleo hopped onto her lap, kneading the fabric of Margaret's cozy sweater. The warmth between them was unspoken but undeniable. It was a comfort for both of them, a quiet ritual that started their day with a sense of connection. There were days when Margaret worked from home, and those days were Cleo's favorite. As Margaret typed away at her desk, Cleo would settle in a sunbeam by the window, her eyes half closed as the warmth from the sunlight bathed her. The soft rhythm of Margaret's typing would soon lull her into a peaceful doze. But it wasn't just about the sunshine. It was about being near Margaret, knowing that this was her place now, that she wasn't alone. Even on days when Margaret went out, Cleo had learned to embrace her time alone. The first few months, she would wait at the door, pacing, sometimes crying softly as the absence of her new owner felt like a gaping hole in the quiet apartment. But Margaret always returned, and Cleo began to realize that her new life had a rhythm, one that included her. When Margaret returned from work or errands, Cleo would rush to the door to greet her, mewing with joy, her tail held high as if declaring, "I'm so glad you're back." Margaret, ever patient and understanding, was quick to reassure her. "I'm always coming back to you, Cleo," she'd say, and the promise of her words seemed to soothe the little cat's worries. Slowly, Cleo began to trust that her place in this home was permanent. And it wasn't just the routine that Cleo had grown accustomed to. It was the love that poured from Margaret, an unconditional, unwavering affection that filled every corner of their home. Margaret would often speak to Cleo in soft, gentle tones, sometimes chatting about her day, sometimes simply saying, "You're such a good girl, Cleo," and every time, Cleo's heart would swell with a sense of belonging she had never known before. On rainy days, when the world outside was washed in shades of gray, Margaret would curl up on the couch with a blanket, and Cleo would settle in beside her, purring contentedly as the storm rumbled in the distance. These moments were the best, the quiet ones, when the two of them could simply exist together. Margaret would occasionally stroke Cleo's fur, her fingers working through the soft coat as the cat melted into the touch. But it wasn't just about the physical comfort, it was about the emotional connection. Margaret had become Cleo's anchor, the one person she knew would always be there for her. And Cleo, in turn, had become Margaret's constant companion, her furry confidant who offered comfort without question. Whenever Margaret felt tired or stressed from her work or life, Cleo would be there, a soft, reassuring presence that never judged, just loved. And there were moments, beautiful, tender moments, when Margaret would find Cleo curled up beside her on the couch or in the bed, nuzzling her head into Margaret's lap, seeking comfort from the woman she had grown to love so dearly. Margaret would smile softly, running her fingers through Cleo's fur, a silent promise to always be there for her. One evening, as winter began to creep in, Margaret found herself sitting on the couch, wrapped in a warm blanket. Cleo hopped up next to her, and for the first time, the cat climbed onto her lap and settled in, purring contentedly as Margaret stroked her back. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. Cleo had never been one for cuddles before, not until now. She had always been so independent, so cautious. But in this moment, nestled against Margaret's chest, Cleo finally felt what she had been missing all along. Home. It wasn't just about the apartment, the soft pillows, or the food in her bowl. It was about the love that filled the space, the security of knowing she would never have to face the world alone again. The peace of having someone to share the quiet moments with. That night, as the world outside grew colder, Cleo and Margaret sat together, wrapped in warmth and love. Margaret sighed contentedly, looking down at her cat who was curled up in her lap, her tail wrapped around her paws. "You're my little shadow, aren't you?" Margaret whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. Cleo blinked lazily, then stretched out, purring louder, the sound vibrating through her whole body. She was content. She was loved. And for the first time, Cleo knew what it meant to truly belong. And that was enough.